Hello, good evening. Welcome to UCSB Campbell Hall. I know it's been a very difficult time in our community. I want to thank you for making the trip here to the university. We're hoping this evening will be a time of healing for our community. So again, I want to thank you very much for being here. My name is Roman Baratiak. I'm the Associate Director at the Arts and Lectures Program. And I want to thank you very much for joining us for a very special evening with Dr. B.J. Miller in conversation with Pico Iyer. This is the second event in our inaugural year of a new series which we've titled Speaking with Pico, although we've had the great honor of producing other conversation events hosted by Pico with many terrific guests over the years, including writers like Amy Tan, Elizabeth Gilbert, Stephen Mitchell, Mark Salzman. He did a great program with photographer Sebastião Salgado, Werner Herzog, the filmmaker. So many, many people. The last event was with Zadie Smith here. Just out of curiosity, how many people were here for that event with Zadie Smith? It was a wonderful evening, so I'm sure we're in for a double special treat this evening. Still to come in the series with Pico is two more events. We'll be hosting curator and creator of Brain Pickings, Maria Popova, on April the 5th. Maria's been called a, quote, human-powered discovery engine for interestingness. And the final event in the series on May 3rd with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Anthony Doerr, the author of All the Light We Cannot See. At this time, please join me in thanking our event sponsors for this evening's event. A very, very special thank you to Dorothy Largay and Wayne Rosing. Thank you so much, Dorothy. I also want to thank our corporate event sponsor, Mission Wealth. I know Seth and Danelle are here. Thank you for your support as well. Also want to thank our community partner, the Natalie Orfalea Foundation and Lou Buglioli, and the Arts and Lectures corporate season sponsor, once again, is Sage Publishing. Tonight's event is presented in association with Cottage Health and is part of our Arts and Lectures thematic learning initiative series titled Creating a Meaningful Life. BJ spent 2 sessions today. We did a 1-hour session at Cottage Rehabilitation Hospital with the occupational therapists, physical therapists, and speech therapists who were there. Thank you very much to the people at the rehab hospital. And then a thematic learning initiative event out at Parish Hall, the Unitarian Society, with about 40 people. And then we have another special event happening with BJ, a private event in the morning over at the Santa Barbara Foundation. So I want to thank BJ for making time in his schedule to be with us here in Santa Barbara. Following the conversation portion of tonight's event, Pico will ask Dr. Miller questions that we've collected in advance via email from many of you who are here in the audience. And please do join us for other lectures we have coming up this quarter. Reza Aslan, many of you know him, the religious scholar, will be here next week on Thursday. He has a new book out called God, A Human History. Condoleezza Rice speaking at the Arlington Theater, Jeffrey Toobin, Matthew Desmond, who is our winter quarter free book giveaway. He's written a book called Evicted about the rental crisis in the country. That's a free book if you're interested. You can contact our ticket office about how to pick up a copy, and there are free copies at the Central Public Library as well. You can also pick up our complete winter schedule. It's in the lobby. Please pick a copy up and take it home. Our host this evening is Pico Iyer. Pico is the author of 2 novels and 10 works of nonfiction and a constant contributor to the New York Times, Harper's, the New York Review of Books, Vanity Fair, and many others. His books have been translated into 23 languages, and 2 of his recent works, The Open Road and The Art of Stillness, made the bestseller lists. In the past 4 years, he's delivered 3 talks for TED, which have been seen by more than 6 million viewers. So it's a great pleasure to have him here again with us. Let's have a warm Santa Barbara welcome for Pico Iyer.
Good evening. I think just to follow up a little on what Roman was saying, when we scheduled this event almost a year ago, of course, we couldn't have guessed that it would come in the very week when Santa Barbara really endured one of its worst tragedies in history. And I'm not sure there's any way that our friends and many of our neighbors can repair their losses. But as we all start picking up our lives again, there seems to be a small place for gratitude that we're visited tonight by somebody who's really cherished across the planet for his gift for healing and for easing people through loss. And if you happen to go to the TED conference every year in Vancouver, you may notice that on the very last morning, after 4.5 really intense days and about 80 presentations, there's a final talk that I think of privately as the wisdom talk, or the monk's talk, in which a very wise being is invited really to put the whole conference into perspective and send everybody out into the world with a larger, almost cosmic vision. Last year, this talk was delivered by Pope Francis, and in earlier years, I've seen it given by the brilliant Tibetan Buddhist monk, Mathieu Ricard, and the very wise Benedictine brother, David Steindl-Rast. 3 years ago, on the last morning, we got to see a video interview with the Dalai Lama. But after the Dalai Lama had finished speaking, suddenly there appeared on stage this rather young, cool, handsome dude. And I think Bill Gates and Larry Page and Jeff Bezos and all the other masters of the universe who were there were looking around a little surprised. And I was thinking, who in the world can speak after the Dalai Lama? And then B.J. Miller began speaking. And within a minute, I was transfixed. And within 5 minutes, I thought, I've almost never heard wisdom delivered in so relaxed and everyday a fashion, almost as if a friend is just dropping in for a beer. And when the full 18-minute talk was concluded, I felt that my life had been changed. And I think many of the more than 5 million who've seen that talk online feel the same way. I was actually so moved that I wrote, for the only time in 5 TED conferences and 300 live presentations, to the head of TED, Chris Anderson, just to thank him for sharing with us B.J. Miller. And as I read up on B.J., I found that at that point he had been executive director of the Zen Hospice Project in San Francisco for 6 years. He was an oncologist, he's a professor, but most of all, he's an expert in palliative care with a remarkable story and unusual charisma, who's really thought long and hard about difficulty, imagination, opportunity, both as a patient and as a physician. And ever since, I seem to run into BJ everywhere. He was on Krista Tippett's public radio program on Being, and for me, he might have been the single most dazzling of all the dazzling guests on that program. Then I bumped into him in Montecito, where he was going to shoot a long segment with Oprah for her TV show. Then I was reading a huge feature about him in the New York Times Magazine. And then even when I picked up the little Australian magazine with the redoubtable name of Dumbo Feather, there was a rich and fascinating interview with BJ. And my sense is that the reason the whole world is reaching out for him is that we all know human beings are living longer and longer, but more life isn't necessarily better life. And I'm guessing everybody in this room has a parent or maybe a grandparent who has lived maybe 10 or 15 years longer than expected, which means living 10 or 15 years often with anxiety and confusion and fear. And we think rightfully a lot about climate change and how fire season lasts through December now and February features 90-degree days here in Santa Barbara. But I often think about the inner climate change, whereby so many of us are living longer than any humans in history. But that means we're living for year after year in the thick of death and uncertainty. And I really don't know anyone who's thought more about this, more intimately, and more imaginatively than BJ. He's just completing a book at the moment called How to Die, a field guide. And as soon as that comes out, he's going to be on every cable TV and mainstream TV station in the nation. So I'm really glad we get to catch him before the meteor hits the Earth. And I hope you'll all join me in offering a really warm Arts and Lectures welcome to really one of my greatest heroes and inspirations, B.J. Miller.
Hello, everybody. I wish the girl I have a crush on back in San Francisco were here to hear that introduction. Darn it. Anyway, thank you, Pico. That was really nice.
Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us at a difficult time. And I suppose the first thing to ask you is, what kind of memories, associations do you have with Santa Barbara?
Beautiful ones, in a word. So I have my good... I was going to actually drop out of medicine. So I had gone into medicine thinking I would be a rehab doc, work with other people in disability, et cetera. And I became disillusioned with it and was going to drop out, et cetera. And then I got turned on to palliative care in a long-winded way. We can talk about that. But so I was all set to quit medicine, and then I had to rethink all of that. And I came and joined the internal medicine residency here at Cottage Hospital. Yes. And it was a beautiful few years of my life. And it really, because I was dreading it. I don't really love practicing internal medicine. I'm not a scientist per se, and it was something I just wanted to get through so that I could get on to palliative care, blah, blah. And, but I ended up loving it. The teaching was extraordinary, the community is extraordinary, and it's so ridiculously gorgeous here. And I had lived in San Francisco for a while, but it was here that I really fell in love with California. And I feel very much a Californian now, and I love coming back here. And, it's probably a good time to mention, guys, that obviously there's a lot in the air right now, and our subject invariably is going to be touching on that air. And just to call it out, I mean, even if this community, I just want to say our community, this community, your community, weren't in the midst of really an acute loss, I still try to think of a way to say to audiences whenever we talk about death and suffering that, like a little warning, that this subject brings up a ton of stuff, and all of us have losses, and some of us are in the midst of new ones right now. So just to call that out, and so you might find yourself giddy in a strange way, or teary in another way, and I guess it's just a commitment for us to speak honestly, and also to basically accept anything that needs to come out of you guys tonight. This should be a very safe place. And thank you for sharing it amidst your acute grief. It's an extra special moment. So I wanted to say that. And one last point about Santa Barbara. I've been very fortunate of late to be asked to be the medical director for the Dream Foundation, which a lot of you guys probably know about. Yeah, a really beautiful organization that does really gorgeous work. And so I've kept a tendril, some reason or excuse to come back here every chance I get. So,
you have this great line in your book that's going to be published, "Tears are not the enemy," which speaks to what you were just saying. And I'm wondering, when you've dealt with people who are suffering the loss of a life, and when you've dealt with people who are suffering losses as a result of natural disasters, have you found it's a similar kind of process?
I think loss on some level is loss. I do. And I can also say this. I was arguing with a friend recently on this point of the treachery of comparing sufferings, comparing losses, and I'm tempted to do it. I was in the Paralympic volleyball team in the 90s, and I remember at the games, everyone was sort of your currency was just how messed up your body could be. I mean, the coolest ones were the guys who were really screwed up. If you had no limbs, you were just, the stuff. And I was pretty good at 3 limbs, but it was a funny vibe though. There was a competitiveness to see who could withstand the grimmest loss. It was interesting, and apropos that weird world that is competitive athletics, outside of that world, though, I really think it's nothing but trouble to compare losses. And I have said this, and I will say it a million times more, I have shed more tears over lost wallets than I have lost limbs. Like, there's something about, this was so huge that I was like, I could not do anything but to submit to it. Lost wallets and car keys drive me crazy because I should have known better, and So anyway, another way of saying no, I think it's very important that we be careful to not compare or contrast our losses. But I will say one more thing. I do think I do also, maybe I'm going to say maybe I'm going to contradict myself. I notice in myself, and I notice in others too, and maybe it's not I think the problem is probably a vertical orientation, better, worse, harder, easier, something like that. But I do think there's a difference, an act of Mother Nature, the phrase, this cosmic spanking, that's just something, is a force so huge and so affecting, rich, poor, white, black, it doesn't matter, skinny, fat, it's absolutely indiscriminate. And I think of this analogy sometimes when I'm talking to patients. If I lost my house to arson, I think I'd feel very different than if I lost my house to, say, a mudslide or fire. All I can say to answer your question, therefore, is I think the feeling, the sensations that come with this, the thoughts that come with this, may very well indeed be different. I can roll over to the gods in ways I can't roll over to something man-made. But I still will circle back to this idea, to be very careful to not compare or contrast our sufferings in a vertical nature.
Yes, and I think we'll get onto this later, but what you just said reminds us how much of every response is basically all in the mind. You're not a Buddhist and I'm not a Buddhist, but the Buddhists tell this great story of if you're in a boat in a lake and another boat hits you. If it's an empty boat, you say, too bad, it was the wind. As soon as they see the guy in the boat, how can you dare do this? You ruined my day, I'm going to sue you. Exactly the same event, but your response is entirely different. Irrationally, foolishly so. We'll switch back to palliative medicine for now, though. You had already decided to pursue palliative medicine before coming here. What made you make that decision?
The impulse for me to get into medicine at all was to make sense of my own experiences as a patient. And I was 19 when I got injured, and so once I was through the acute, the horror of that I knew I was going to live, etc. I knew I had to. This was too big an event to just sort of put behind me, and I'd learned from my mother the whole sort of. My mother had polio. She has post-polio syndrome and is progressively disabled from it. So I've been around the subject of disability my whole life. And what a beautiful thing my mother offered me in sort of preparation for my own disability. And thanks to her and what she taught me around sort of the activism of disability and of it being of access being a civil right, not the stuff of pity or charity, etc. I had a running start. I didn't have to hate myself because I no longer looked a certain way. And that was really helpful. And I also, because of all that backdrop, I really knew that this was juicy. I was learning from it. And I was at college, and I was learning just as much, if not more, from this experience as I was from my classroom. And so anyway, it seemed way too big to just let it go or to try to, even worse, overcome it. I'm not interested in overcoming it. This is my reality. And so this is sort of, it seemed like I could be an agent on behalf of all that my mom had taught me, really. So that was the backdrop of why I wanted to go into medicine. Not because, and I did never take pre-med classes. I was an art history major. I had never thought about going into medicine. But the idea was to get a bag of tricks that I could use to be of service in the world and to make sense of this. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but you gave a long-winded intro, so that's why I got into medicine. And I saw part of the lesson learned, of course, is that, okay, few of us are missing a few limbs, but all of us, this is a variation on a theme of loss. And one of the very first things I learned as a patient was the incredible bond that everyone suffers, right? I mean, I love asking audiences, anyone here not suffered? Is any hand going up? Okay. I think that's a really important point. And it's also dovetails into mortality, that 100% of us do it. And therefore, it's an amazing thing to have in common. Rather than this thing that isolates us and separates us one from the next, if you see these as variations on themes, loss is a loss is a loss on some level, well, therefore, I feel just as much part of this human club as ever, if not more so. So these were the things that I was learning in a very therapeutic and personal way that I wanted to repurpose in my work. So, but I was off to med school. I thought I'd do rehab medicine, and then I kind of fell out of love with it at the end of med school. My sister died by her own hand, which is its own thing, and everything just sort of disintegrated in a lot of ways. And I think I went through what probably most people in healthcare, if they haven't, they probably should go through some disillusionment with reconciling the idealism of something like medicine and healthcare with the practicalities of practicing it. So for all these reasons, I was getting turned off. But then I was in Milwaukee. My parents were in Milwaukee. I headed back to spend a year with them to do my internship. I was going to stop after my internship, just do that, get my license to practice, and then call it a day. And I did an elective rotation in palliative care. And within an hour, completely sold. It was exactly why, what this field was espousing was exactly why I went into this work in the first place, to make sense of my experience, to see unity and bonds in suffering and pain rather than the opposite. This sort of brutal but powerful recognition of reality and all the things we can't control about it. The absolutely sort of underdeveloped aspects of our healthcare system around how we suffer and how we die. So that seemed like an opportunity, and certainly job security. There was all these reasons to love it, and it was inherently interdisciplinary. I didn't have to be this doctor on high who pretended to know everything. I could be this nice, humble guy with holes in his clothes and not wear a white coat and still fit in. I mean, it just opened up healthcare for me in all the ways I'd hoped. And so that's why I went into palliative care.
And it's basically about emotional intelligence as much as medical wisdom. And that's probably what you're on the receiving end of. I mean, as you navigate the day, what you're responding to is partly how we're responding to you. And I've heard you say, I think, that you have an advantage because everybody in this room is wounded or disabled in certain ways, but your disability is visible. So people actually may be kind to you in the way they wouldn't to some of the rest of us.
Yep.
I always feel sorry for you for one reason, which is everybody wants to hear your story. So maybe I'll take you out of your misery. And for the few people here who don't know what happened to BJ, tell me if I get this wrong. You were 19 years old, a sophomore at Princeton. You returned from Thanksgiving break. You hadn't seen your friends for a while. You printed out a religious studies essay. And then you went out late at night with your friends to the Wawa market in search of a sandwich. And you came to the Dinky, which is the little train that links the university to Princeton Station, and you jumped on the top of it, and the power was live, and 11,000 volts caught your watch and went through you 20 feet, and then you woke up 2 days later in the burn unit. Is that right?
All right.
How long did it begin? How long was it before you began to think in the way you were just describing and say, well, actually, there are things that link me with people as opposed to separating, that this doesn't have to be just a loss?
Oh, man, your memory's good, Pico. That is impressive. So the answer to your question, though, is practically immediately.
Really?
All thanks to my mother's example. So I knew, I also was, perhaps also thanks to my mom's example, just being in touch with when life doesn't go your way. And I was raised in often relatively affluent communities. I went to good schools and all that stuff. And part of my anguish was my outer world didn't match my inner world. And that was its own kind of suffering. That was its own kind of misery. And I also was really in tune with my mom and watching how the world responded to her and the projections and how she could be so soft and elegant in her way and so tough in her way, and just the whole gamish of it, all the things that she had learned by just dealing with her life, not in some theatrical way. This was not recreational for her or affected. So I, in a way, I remember one of the first things, the first surgery, there were a handful of surgeries. The first surgery was, I think, 5 days in. And I remember coming out of, it was strange, the whole time was very strange. But I remember coming out of anesthesia and being wheeled out and seeing my mom after the first amputations, and she's just looks so sad. I mean, miserable. And I have a big smile on my face because A, the drugs were great, and B, all I could think about, and this is a comment on my mother, please hear it that way, but all I could think about was, Mom, finally you and I have so much more in common now. And I remember watching her face. She just kind of crumpled. It was in a gorgeous way. It was so, and because part of it was real, I felt like now I understand, now I was going to understand all the things that I had sort of vicariously seen, but really didn't feel privy to or something like that. Now my life merged in a way that in some level, I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, there's all sorts of other layers to this mix too, but on some level there was some layer of relief in it. There was some layer of, I don't know, it felt right. I don't know how to put it without shortchanging the whole experience. But that came pretty immediately. And I will say, I didn't feel a confidence that came. There was not a confidence that came immediately with it. And that giddy thing didn't last for more than a few seconds at any one time. But it was sort of like between her and my family and my friends and all these healthcare providers working so hard, there was I could see they were holding this sweetness for me, this love zone for me, while I recovered and while I became convinced of what they were showing me. I became convinced that I actually still belonged, maybe more than ever, and maybe that I was still going to be okay, and maybe I could even be whole, even in pieces. They held that conclusion, and so I just had to bridge myself to them. Felt like being out at sea, perhaps, and seeing a land, seeing an island. That you had a goal, you could reach it, and they held that land for me. So I didn't feel all this immediately. I felt all this immediately. I didn't actually embody it immediately. I didn't get there. I knew immediately that was possible and was the way it was going to happen because they were showing that to me. They were looking me in the eye. They weren't ashamed of me. They loved me. It was beautiful.
And I think one of the things I always get when I hear your story is just this sense that many years on, the things that look as if they were really bad were not necessarily as bad as they seemed, and many things that seemed wonderful at the time didn't lead to anything. And we were just backstage with somebody who lost her house this week, and she was talking about all the outpouring of kindness that was coming her way. I was thinking of, I lost my house, as so many have, in a forest fire some years ago. And I remember waking up the next morning, and in some ways, all my dreams were gone. So pre-digital days, I not only lost all my mementos and my notes, but I lost my next 8 years of work, my next 3 books, everything. And so I sort of thought, well, this is the time pretty much to stop being a writer. And it took a little while to adjust. Then after a while, when I started replacing the things in my house, I found I really didn't need anything. And then I thought, well, wait a minute, I've been spending a lot of time in Japan. Why don't I go and live there? That losing my house here liberated me to go to the place that maybe I should have been already. And then I thought, well, in those days I spent a lot of time in Cuba. I was possessed by Cuba, and I'd lost the book I'd been working on about Cuba for many years. And I thought, wait, I have an imagination. Why don't I just come at Cuba through memory and imagination without my notes? Be a different kind of writer than I would have been. And so, as you were saying, it's not as if everything is rosy, but it's certainly not as if everything is desolation. And so many things I wouldn't have had the courage to do, that life prodded me towards, and I'm so grateful to them now. All that said, though, when you began studying palliative medicine, how do you learn how to be with people who are dying?
Well, you probably has a lot to do with learning to be with people who are living. And I don't mean that in a sort of a pat way or an overly convenient way. It's just the fact, it's just one of these just brute facts. It's just around us all the time. Especially when you get beyond the world of just us humans. I mean, you just drive down the street, there's dead leaves, or dead bugs, there's dead, it's just everywhere. And it's not dead stuff over here, live stuff over here. It's one in the same pile, And then internally, of course, there are little deaths happening all the time in us, And thank you for reminding me too of, I want to hopefully I can get back to this track, but when you were describing your own experience with the fire, Pico, there's something, we're so much tougher than we think we are, We people are so much more resilient than we behave sometimes or think we are. It's really amazing, but that would just sound theoretical until something really big comes along. And it's sort of like, I don't know if you felt perhaps changed by that fire, and I don't know that I really felt changed by my injuries. It's more that I got to feel a certainty that I could handle something. Right? There was a pride that I could actually handle something, whereas before there was an embarrassment that nothing really that bad had gone wrong. And I was so happy to see I was more or less the same person before and after the injury. I just needed that proof. I needed some proof, and I wonder if you feel, if that registers with you at all.
As you say, that we can do much more than we imagined we could, because you, in some ways, weren't the same person. You were dealing with all kinds of things you took for granted.
Yeah.
Not least when you went back to college, you were, I think, probably in a golf cart and wearing a compression vest, and just at the time when one wants to blend in, you were strikingly different from everyone else.
Yeah.
And yet found that was not a bad thing,
Yeah.
I'm guessing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'll see if I can entwine that, your point there, with the last question about being with people who are dying. I think life's just weird. Life's just, life is just wacky. I can't believe, and we do our best to keep it sort of orderly. We wear the same outfit. We have similar haircuts. We do a lot to kind of keep ourselves in check so we know we can recognize each other's fellow humanoids or whatever. But the fact is, let's just be, just empirically, I'm not being woo-woo, we are on the same, we're on the same planet at the same time. We're in the same room right now, in the same galaxy, the same universe. I mean, it's outrageous. It's just amazing. And it's just in front of us all the time. And I don't know where I was going with that, but I just love thinking about that. I don't know where I was going with that. But I love that thought. I guess I was talking about how weird life is, how strange it is. And what is this normal thing that we keep holding ourselves, these standards of, it happens in healthcare, this standard of health, or these boring normal people. And I'm not sure who they are. I've never met one of them. But we keep holding ourselves to this standard. And the greatest gift this thing probably did for me was to help me, we started saying earlier, just check myself in this endless comparing and contrasting we do with others. Am I good enough, smart enough? And we use that gauge is usually external. And that's an impulse we all have. We're social animals, but boy, we need to keep that one in check. And I think, so to try to circle back to this question of being with someone who's dying, is if you can keep, what dying is this incredible piece of realism. And if you can keep this whole wacky realism in your field of view, frame of reference, then everything's pretty okay, because you're still part of, even as a dead thing, you're still part of something. And so I think that seems to be part of the discipline around being around death or suffering, is you hold the right window, the right frame. You're not comparing inappropriately or contrasting inappropriately. You're including everything in your field of view. And therefore, you're not surprised by anything. Therefore, you always belong to something. Therefore, you always have something in common with everybody around you, no matter what their color, no matter what their species, no matter whether even they're an animate object at all. So, and then I'll say one more thing about the answer to your question. In terms of really so that's a sort of a worldview that allows for all this to be okay, at least for me. But I think maybe what you're asking too, Pico, is in terms of acquiring a skill set, besides a perspective, which is the biggest, I think is if I had to say one skill to learn to be around folks who are very closer to the end than you are, is just the skill of not running away from suffering, not running away from something that's hard, not running away from something that you can't change. I think that's the biggest trick.
And I'm guessing with many terminal patients, they are calmer than the people around them. They have accepted that reality, and it's their loved ones who are fighting it for understandable reasons.
Yeah.
And your job is probably to work with the loved ones as much as with the patient.
Absolutely. And that's by the way, that is the Articles of Confederation of the field of hospice and palliative medicine is patient and family centric. That is the unit of care. So it's not the family you get to them if you have time. They're front and center in this work all the time. And family, not necessarily blood, family by choice.
And that's a hard one. I mean, I was thinking, as I was reading your book, I'm often dismissive of loved ones who want to keep a patient alive even when the patient wants to leave, probably. And then I was thinking, well, if my wife was on life support, how would I ever have the courage to pull the plug? How could you do that? And yet, not doing that is probably worse for everybody. So you're probably helping people navigate those moments. You were telling me over dinner you just lost a patient that you've been through a lot with, and now you're dealing with his spouse, and she's got all kinds of emotions.
Yeah. I'll tell you guys about them. I'll use their names because I know they would like it. John was his name. He died December 30th, and Pamela, his wife, and she and I are still in touch. And I've known them. They were my patients in clinic 2.5 years or so. And when I first met them, they were referred to our clinic to help with end-of-life planning. He was many years into his efforts with leukemia, had been through all sorts of treatments, and it looked like the end was probably near. So that's why they came to see us. But the end didn't come. He just kept hanging in there. And this is a variation on this happens a lot, which is this weird mix of good and bad news. I often think we could do so much better if this is probably a writer's note, is just let go of adjectives. They really gum us up. Because good, bad, I mean, it's all together, really. And Pamela it was such an exquisite experience watching them navigate this impending, sort of imminent death that went on for 2+ years. That is a very long time to be in this sort of, this could be the last time. Tonight is the last time I see you. In some ways, we should live our lives like that. Perhaps, maybe, kind of, sort of. But that's really, really hard to do, especially in our society. And so, anyway, part of the work with Pamela and what you and I were talking about is so poignant, which is she loved John, absolutely was devoted to his care, put so much of her life on hold to be with him, to be his advocate, etc. But very early on in the arc, John was more or less fine. He was sort of a stoic to begin with, but he actually really felt pretty good, all things considered. So between his own worldview, his attitude, and the way his body was going, he was doing pretty fine. But he always showed up at appointments so that we could see his wife, because she wasn't the patient, really. And even though we say this in palliative care, in the cancer center, there's no billing mechanism for this, right? The patient is John. She's not sick. So we kind of sneak her in. And so John would sort of sit there and, tolerate the appointments on some level, pretend he had needs he didn't really have. And then Pamela, and much of the work was with Pamela. And one of the things that kept coming up was it was insufferable, it was intolerable. She had put so much of her life on hold because of this imminence of his death. She couldn't really kind of stop that because any day now it could change. He was at the tail end of this drug, and then another drug came out that actually seemed to help him and work. And there was a promise of yet another drug. Sort of the immunotherapy that you guys may be hearing about was actually working for him in a lot of ways. And so this very good news of John doing so well was very hard news for Pamela. She could not bear it. And some of the conversations were brutal because essentially what she was saying was, John, please die. I can't, I just cannot do this anymore. So it was a stunning thing to behold. And John was so beautiful. You could imagine being really hurt to hear, to feel such an emotion from your beloved. But he understood. He was a wise dude, and he understood. And mostly he just loved Pamela, and he wanted whatever she needed. That was his advance directive in so many ways. So finally John died, and at home. And Pamela didn't think she was going to be able to handle it. And we talked about maybe moving him to a different place, a hospice house. But she, in the end, didn't need it. And he didn't need it. And the family rallied around. And everything went just about as smoothly as it could possibly humanly go. Everyone put aside their differences, gathered round, kissed Dad goodbye, said beautiful things. Everything as good as can be. Which is really an important part of the story because Pamela's so critical. She would be so poised to see failure in her own behavior somehow, if she screwed something up, and I think a lot of us have that. But now, working and talking with Pamela, of course, there's something that we've been looking out for explicitly for about 1.5 years, which is some of the things you're saying, inventing now in caring for John while he's alive, might come back and bite you in some level, someday when he's actually gone. Because you're going to act, as intolerable as this day is, you're going to actually miss it. You're going to miss this intolerable day, And it was it was like a dance back and forth, sort of dropping in these reminders every so often, just so that they didn't lose that fact, and nor do we want to shame Pamela for these feelings because they were so real. So it's just a good case in point where these things are they're really exquisite. And the pain, sometimes couples can sort of withstand this pain, and sometimes they volley it. They trade it off. One will hold it for a while, the other will hold it for a while. And now, Pamela and I are still in close contact, and there's a lot to remind her of so much to be proud of, and so much hard work. And that she didn't ultimately wish him dead. She didn't ultimately try to hasten anything. She didn't ultimately try to talk him out of that therapy that he really wanted to try. And everyone's better off for it. So anyway, that's a little bit of the story of John and Pamela.
And also, you were reminding me earlier today that even the emotional thing, which is complicated enough, isn't the whole story. And you told me about a patient of yours who got kind of a reprieve. Things were going well. And she was devastated because she didn't have any money. She was assuming she would die, and she'd used her money, and then told she has more life to live. Suddenly, where does she go? Yeah.
So I don't have her permission to, so I'll make a name up. We'll call her Peggy. And Peggy, this is a common story, and becoming more and more common. Which is, so she first got her cancer diagnosis in 1991. And she had 3 different cancer diagnoses, 3 separate primary tumors. Really odd stuff. And she kept surviving them. And some new therapy would come along just in time. She'd survive. She had bone marrow transplants, all sorts of stuff. And at some point, trying to be cool with the reality of her prognosis, she didn't have unlimited resources, so she couldn't work as a full-time patient in a lot of ways, and so she was parsing her money very carefully and to schedule so that she could get through her life and to her death about 8 years ago. She's still alive. So she's had this really odd mix of really, she really wants to live. She wants to be alive in this body. In fact, I was just on the phone with her tonight. She just got scan results, yet again, and she's doing fine. Disease is stable, is quiet. Her cancer is just asleep. And she's thrilled. And right behind that smile is a tear of, now shit, now how am I going to afford the next round of this or that, next month's rent? So this very harsh mix of really practical issues right next to these very profound issues, and they're all in the mix. Mm-hmm. And we could say, oh, well, life and death is way more important than money, and blah, blah, we don't. Well, yeah, the experience of being sick and dying is expensive, and you are going to be affected by resources largely. For most of us will be. And I mean, it's a reminder too, and I don't mean it necessarily, we can go political if we want, but I think it's, that healthcare, illness is the sort of number one cause of personal bankruptcy. And I think the number is 70% of those bankruptcies had health insurance. So you think if you have insured, we talk about the insured and the uninsured, like that's the dividing line. Well, that is not really the dividing line, people. And so to live and die well with illness, especially because we keep having these successes and living longer, we're buying ourselves new and new reams of ways to struggle. And our technology is way faster than our ethos can keep up. And so we're inventing more and more problems with our good news. And by the way, my message is not turn down the faucet on innovation and development and we should stop living so long. That's not the news. It's just, again, the discipline is taking a fuller view of reality and being transparent to it. And if not trying to solve it, at least not running away from it. So that's the purpose of my comments. And please, I want to be careful. Sometimes in healthcare, especially in palliative medicine, it's very easy to be critical of the healthcare system. There's a lot to be critical of. There's also a lot it's extraordinary too. I am alive because of it. So again, a huge pile of conflicting emotions. And
I guess the challenge is for the humanity to keep up with the technology. The technology is advancing in wonderful, liberating ways, but our emotions don't always keep pace. Mm-hmm. And as I listen to you, I'm also thinking, I have a friend whose younger brother died very early of AIDS. And he said to her something that she always repeats now, which is, it's not change that hurts, it's resistance to change. Mm-hmm. Henry David Thoreau said, death is beautiful if you see it as a law, not an accident. Mm-hmm. Of course, that doesn't make it easier to see it as a law. Mm-hmm. What do most of us fail to understand about dying or death?
You had given me these questions earlier, man. Just kidding. Just kidding. It's way more fun this way. I'm tempted to say, and a lot of us in hospice and palliative medicine, we somehow so easily slip into our social cues. We very easily slip into this idea that death is somehow optional. That and so therefore, if you take that option, well, you're a loser or a failure or something like that. And in the same way, we have such a language issue around this stuff, the way we go to war with our illnesses, and okay, that language marshals an energy in us. That's some serious language, and it marshals some serious energy, and I understand that. And it's, on some level, useful. I remember my own battle cries. The hard part is we struggle to transition. We confuse our language. I just think about this a lot. We confuse the way we represent reality with our language and our symbols. We confuse those things with the reality they're trying to represent. So there's a huge distinction in there to be made. Death, there's no justice. We weren't promised anything. Is a 10-year life a long life? Is 100 years a long life? There's no, this. The tragedies, etc., are not necessarily because God went back on His promise or something. Let's be clear. And just because someday we're going to die, we should watch our language and we should be able to segue to a different mindset. Or maybe if we want to stick with war, let's go to war against peace, fight for peace, excuse me. So we can marshal that energy just towards a different end. So circling around to your question, I think the big thing that we all fail to realize is this distinction between the reality and the ways we try to make reality more digestible. And then we're surprised when those digestible things turn out to not be the whole thing. So let us never be surprised that we die. Let us never be surprised that life's hard. That lends itself to some gratuitous suffering.
I think what we often witness in hospital rooms now is this tug of war between the typical physician whose investment and job it is to keep the patient alive, and maybe the palliative care person whose job is to reconcile the patient to the fact she's dying. And so the doctor's doing everything possible, so keep on going. We're fighting this disease. And you're saying, let's make peace with this disease and accept it. And by accepting it, make every day richer, given that the days are limited. Is that right?
It's almost right. Where it's almost, so we have to watch our biases. So I and most people who work in hospice and palliative medicine, I think when it's my time, I will want comfort. I will want peace. I will want, calm, and I'll be accepting and all these good things. But lesson one that you have to relearn a million times, as we talk about it here, this subject, as an abstraction, when we're really standing at the edge of our horizon, I don't know how I'm going to feel. Even though I've been close, I've been near that edge, I still don't really know how I'm going to feel when it's my actual time.
Yeah.
So I want to reserve the right to howl at the moon and resist and go kicking and screaming if that's just what I need to do.
Yeah.
I don't think that's what I'm going to do. That's certainly not my goal to do that. But let us not shame each other if it goes that way. And so that's one note. Another note is, even right out of the chutes, a lot of people see themselves, their sense of self is as a fighter. These are the guys, when I go in as a palliative care doc, my job is not necessarily to bridge them to this reality per se, or get them to accept it. My job is really to understand this person and link them to the kind of care that's going to serve them best. So if you and I have a long conversation, I get to know you, Pico, and it turns out your identity, your sense of self is all about you're a fighter. I may go back to the oncologist or internist who's asked me to come talk to you, and ostensibly to try to talk you into dying sometime soon, and say, no, full code, this guy, he wants the chemo bag hanging in the ICU. That's the right way out for him.
Yeah.
So, there's a sort of a
Yes.
meta level that includes folks
Yes.
who don't
Yes.
necessarily
Yes.
ever have any interest in accepting any of this.
There's no right answer. Your job is to find out what the patient's answer or wishes.
It's absolutely, this is sort of why the job is endlessly fascinating, is so devoted to the subjective. We can know things, there's pattern recognition, there's a body of knowledge, there's transfer of experience and wisdom and other things that can be useful, but ultimately this experience of life and experience of death is so incredibly subjective, and it's annoying to the rest of medicine, but it's delightful to us in palliative care. Yeah.
And I know you're no longer working with the Zen Hospice Project, but what are some of the things you did there that you think made the dying experience better?
So Zen Hospice Project, well, I tell you, the reason I took that job, there are two things that really stand out about that place to me. And I saw a little bit of it here in Santa Barbara, Sarah House and Serenity House. And so two things. One is I'm really interested in design and architecture and the material world, how we manipulate the material world, how we are affected by it, how we are the material world, etc. So whether it's art or architecture or anything, I think I get very excited by crafting an environment. So it's basically making a stage for things to play out on. I sometimes think about, if you were designing a hospice house from scratch, where so the current cues would have you, so if I were an architect and someone asked me to design a hospice house, most of the language out there is, well, you want it to feel like home. And I understand that, because everyone says they want to die at home, so if they can't be at home, let's make it feel and look like home. Okay, good. But I would say don't stop there. Like, where else can we borrow cues? Like, I think gallery spaces, museum spaces, architecture that gets out of the way for the art, in a way that our hospice house could get out of the way for the family and the patient's drama to play out. What about our churches, our temples, where sacred and beautiful things happen, where you have a reverence just by walking in the door? These are I'd love to see if we could borrow cues from these things. Transit stations, things that are meant for temporary use. Also, who knows? But so anyway, digress a little bit. But so Zen Hospice, one of the things I loved about it was it was a Victorian house in San Francisco. It was a place, and it wasn't a hospital. A lot of people say they want to die at home. Okay, but what I think most of us really means we don't want to die in a hospital or in an institutional setting. I think that's what most of us actually mean. So Zen Hospice was a place, and a gorgeous place at that. So that was very exciting for me. And then the second thing was that the foundation of care at Zen Hospice is being a human being. That's what what qualifies you to work at a place like Zen Hospice. Not my MD or my RN or my MSW degree or whatever, or not my divinity degree. I don't need to pass a test to be dying. I need to pass a test to care about someone who's dying. And so a place like Zen Hospice that roots itself in the spiritual dimension or humanistic dimension is palpably and beautifully different as well. So those are the two things that attracted me to the place. And in terms of my time there, I think what we were trying to do was, it felt like we were sitting on this beautiful little secret, that the world needed much more of this place, or needed more places like it. I still believe that to be true. So my time there had a lot to do with trying to open it up a little bit, bring medical students into the place, bring students of any kind into the place. There's an old tension in hospice between the medical world and the non-medical world. And in the U.S., hospice was largely a non-medical thing. It was a social movement in the 70s and 80s. And medicine got in the mix, and medicine has a lot to say about everything it does, and has consumed a lot of this sort of spirit in some ways. So there's actually a tension. And so what I was trying to do at Zen Hospice was trying to move past that tension, because if anything needs healing, I would say it's our healthcare system. So why would we keep this beauty from the healthcare system? Because the healthcare system is filled with people who are incredibly devoted, who work so frigging hard to be of service. But the system they're laboring in is, unfortunately, is not designed so well, so it causes trouble. But the people aren't the ones necessarily causing the trouble. So boy, I'm going on, I'm sorry. There's a lot wrapped in there. So anyway, part of my experience at Zen Hospice was playing out those two impulses around the structure and the spirit of care, and then trying to open it up so that it wasn't a cloistered environment for its own little clubhouse, so that healthcare could start to see a different way of working. So medical students, nursing students, et cetera, could see a different way of doing this.
So when you talk about healing the health system, which is something everyone in this room wants to see happen, does that mean taking some of the stress off the doctor and bringing more of the humanity into their job, or what kind of things do you have in mind?
So, trying to reconcile the fact that healthcare is filled with incredibly devoted, kind people, and the fact that it costs way too much and doesn't do a good enough job in all sorts of ways. Those two things they're both true. All I can come up with is, therefore, so what's wrong? All I can come up with, therefore, is that as a system, it's poorly designed. So what I think I mean, and I think a lot of people mean, is it's designed, healthcare for the last 170 years or so has been a scientific pursuit, a reductive pursuit, an objectifying pursuit, and that it focused on, the scientific method was essentially to focus on disease. The disease was the cause of all this trouble, so work like hell to combat disease, do away with disease, and you've done away with suffering, and everyone lives happily ever after. I think we're in the middle of a reckoning. So think about if you were around when penicillin came on the scene and infectious diseases were the #1 cause of death. wouldn't you, hey, well, we're done with infection. How many folks were sitting around saying, well, maybe those bacteria are actually smarter than we are and are going to mutate and get past our drugs, and we're going to have to come up with new drugs no one was thinking that, because it would be crazy to think that. Yet that's what's happened. Or forestall heart disease, only to find you've invented some other disease that was waiting in the wings to come out, but you had to get to 70 years old to find it, or whatever it is. So long story short, we're in this reckoning where we're not going to stamp out disease. We're not going to stamp out death. We're not going to stamp out suffering, not anytime soon. So maybe perhaps rather than to go to war, and a war that we can't win, maybe we should sort of change the dynamics of the game. So I think what a lot of us are hoping for is this design flaw is to, rather than focus on the disease, you just simply focus on the person with the disease. Sounds pretty easy, right? Sounds pretty convenient. And I do think a lot would flow from that design shift. All of a sudden, the humanities would have all sorts of purchase in place within healthcare. I wouldn't be very exotic, and this is happening, by the way. A lot of my classmates at UCSF were humanities majors. A lot of us who had been out of college for a few years and had lived a life. I still feel so sorry for some of my young colleagues who are trying to counsel their patients on death and dying in their mid-20s who look even younger than that, who have not been out in the world at all. How the heck are they supposed to do that? So, man, do you have this effect on everyone? You just get them talking and just they go. Sorry, I guess my point is, so maybe what would be really cool is if we asked the Department of Health and Human Services to rewrite, I'm sure there is a mission statement to the Department of HHS. I would love to see, healthcare should write a mission statement, because that would reveal so much. And I would think that the mission should have something to do with, that the mission should have something to do with serving people, not combating diseases. You can combat diseases till you're blue in the face on behalf of serving people, just need to be on behalf of this larger thing. Then it's not medicine versus the world. It's medicine, sure, that has something to offer. Spirituality, sure, that has something to offer. Social work, sure, has something. All these things can play at this idea of serving humanity. Social workers ain't going to do much to stamp out disease. So we can rejigger this pecking order. I think so much would flow from that. Okay, I'll stop.
Because by certain accounts now, 50% of the physicians in this country are suffering from burnout, and that number's not going down. And I've met people who say, I want to be a nurse, not a physician, because the nurse is actually the one who really has the hands-on contact with the patient and is very strongly invested in the emotional health of that person. The doctor has too much to think about.
Yeah.
You must run into that a lot.
I do. And nurses burn out too.
Yeah.
I think there is also a critique here, a social critique here that I think we ask, especially of our hospitals. I think we ask far too much of them. They've become our church. They've become our families. And they're not designed for that.
Cottage hospitals become our cafeteria.
Yeah.
Food is so good. Many of us go there just for lunch.
I bet. What a physical plant that place is. What an amazing place that cottage is. I mean, so yeah, but we ask way too much of our healthcare system in so many ways. I do think that we made a mistake separating the medical world from the social world. If you go to any ER, it's packed with people who are there for non-medical reasons. And their social reasons affect their medical reasons. We don't have a line in us that is so divvied up. Oh, your medical pieces go over there, your social pieces go over there. We just don't work that way. We do in a lab, but again, if we were focusing on people, we wouldn't make that silly, that false dichotomy.
And to go back to people, is it your experience that sometimes somebody with an incurable condition has a capacity to some extent to choose to keep going? In other words, we hear a lot of stories about somebody who's very ill and his granddaughter's about to graduate, and somehow, out of nowhere, he keeps on going, he attends graduation and then leaves. Does that happen a lot?
It does a lot. I think you ask anyone who works in hospice, they'll tell you a story or two about someone who told you, I just got to make it to my niece's wedding, and then that's all,
So that means your job is to find out what is most important for that person, and therefore also to ease them towards letting go.
Ease them if letting go is what they want to do.
Yeah.
It's just more make sure they're dealing with all that we know. that they're dealing with a full hand of facts, per se. And I will say some folks aren't even interested in knowing everything there is to know about their situation. And even that's fine. There are certain cultural traditions where you keep this news from the patient out of respect. Is it my position to say, oh, that's wrong, your culture, that's the wrong way to go? If that way is serving you, but that's the question, is that way serving you? And my job is to find out what's serving them.
Yeah, my wife came to me, she's Japanese, and a couple of years ago she came and said, oh, by the way, I only just found out I had cancer 10 years ago. And I said, the doctor didn't tell you? And she said, no, he wanted to wait till 10 years, and then he could see I was fine. And I said, weren't you outraged? She said, no, what a clever, kind thing to do. But, but in Japan, traditionally, physicians don't tell patients or their family when they have cancer. And I was very shocked by that, but I read in the US in the 1950s, often, well, cancer was the word you never said, and even a physician might not always tell a patient, depending on...
It's still
really, there we go.
To some degree.
So it's not a cultural thing, it's just the case itself.
It is still.
Yeah.
And we're all in some collusion. It's not so simple as those darn doctors don't tell the truth. It's those darn patients don't want to hear the truth as much.
And it will hurt their condition.
Oh, absolutely.
To hear the truth.
So one thing we're learning more and more is you can do harm with the truth if you're not careful. So I've watched a lot of well-intended residents say, I'm going to march in there, I'm going to be just courageous, and I'm going to tell them the truth of their situation. And they'll go in and do that, decimate the person, walk out, be very proud that they've dared to tell the truth, and they've just left this heap in the room. So there's a way, it's not just say the truth or not. It's all of this comes down, so much of it's not whether we die, but how we die. It's not whether we tell the truth, but how we tell the truth. So we have to communicate in a certain way, we have to listen in a certain way, we have to dole out this news in a certain way, we have to own the stuff that we don't know, we have to be true to that as well. So it's very, really, you can imagine, really, really tricky. There's no one way to do this, and it's not so simple as just saying, be honest with your patients. You need to support them through that too.
Yeah. Well, I'm feeling bad because I wanted to talk to you about your dog, Vermont, about whom you speak so wonderfully. And I wanted to cite the great philosopher Loretta Lynn, who said, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And I wanted to talk to you about aesthetics, too. But you, before you came, said there's one thing that's really important. I want as many questions as possible from the audience.
Yeah.
So I will stop my questions now. And soliciting them in advance, we got some really, a huge
Doozies.
sheaf of wonderful questions. So this is from all of you. And the first one is, the path to becoming a physician is long, complicated, rigorous, and at times filled with absurd hoops and seemingly unnecessary obstacles. It's common for young medical students and physicians to become cynical, institutionalized, and to forget why they wanted to become a physician in the first place. What advice do you have for the students in the audience who are interested in a rewarding career in medicine? How can they stay true to the values that set them on that path, avoid burnout, and maintain a rewarding and fulfilling career?
Anything else? Win the lottery too? It's a really important, and let us, that's got to be realistic. Let's make sure that is a realistic, I mean, I poke fun of it right out of the chute, but should be a very realistic desire and pursuit. So how do we do that? One is, I think, this design shift that we're talking about, so that my job as a physician isn't confused with just having more knowledge and ability to do more stuff to people, but so much of my job is learning to sit with people for whom I can't do anything. So if you take this as your job description, in a way, it's a bigger job description, but in some ways, it's easier insofar as you get to truly bring your whole self to the picture, not just your skill set and your stethoscope and your frontal lobes. Like you bring your body, your person, your time, your energy. So I think part of the answer to burnout and part of the answer to this good question is this redesign of healthcare and what it's really all about. So that we don't accidentally try to aspire to an impractical thing. So that's one answer. I think you watch this sense of perspective, this sense of self, this sense of curiosity is more something, by the time someone gets to medical school, that's something we have to protect. That's not something we have to inculcate. It's something that we have to help our students preserve and develop, but most of the time that's there. That gets whittled out. That gets, somewhere along the way you get convinced that that's less important than knowing some new differential diagnosis or something else. So we as teachers and attendings can help our students by making sure they stay human. So one thing I love to do with medical students, when I was in the hospital more often, I would assign them, tonight's homework was to, I love doing this, call grandma or go to the movies. They just look at me like, what? Because it's so fun. I mean, it's like fun teaching at a place like UCSF, like UCSB, I'm sure too, or Cottage. All these guys so smart, and there's all this. You have to tone them down. You have to turn them, not get them to work. You have to get them to not work so much sometimes. So it was a lot of fun. It is a lot of fun to assign this sort of human protecting homework. Because if I had said, please go read 3 books tonight, they'd be like, yeah, good, going to do that. No, gonna do that. But going to the movies was exotic to them. So it's fun to kind of invert that. And that's one way to go. I think remembering, where were we today where Asclepius came up? The myth of Asclepius, I learned this from Michael Carney, who's a palliative care doc here in Santa Barbara, who's an amazing person. He taught me the myth of Asclepius, the idea of the wounded healer. And that we really get good at the healing arts by tending to our own lives. And so if you remind students that it is part of their job to take care of themselves, not like in just to go to the gym and eat your kale, but like really like lean into your life, including its miseries, own them, work with them. They're part of your agency. They're not in the way, they're part of the point. They're exactly what's going to give you something in common with your patient, with whom otherwise you don't have much in common. So that's the kind of, it's sort of a mental shift, and it works pretty well. It's hard. And another thing, I guess the other piece of advice is taking your breaks when you actually get them. I watch myself and others, we stay revved up. This came up earlier today, thinking about crisis, thinking about like acute crises, like we all in this town know right now. Sometimes you can get stuck in crisis mode. You get so amped up, you're revving high, and you don't want to rev down because then you're going to fall asleep. So you stay high, and that's really toxic after a while. We know this; it's a real problem. So another piece of the advice would be take your breaks where you get them, even if it's for a minute. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons I love being a resident here in Santa Barbara, I'd go out on the balcony and look out at the sunsets, or look up at the mountains. It took 2 seconds. Or look up at the sky. I mean, all the answers to the wonderment and curiosity and the sense of proportionality is waiting for you just looking up in the sky all the time, anytime. Mm-hmm. So it's not like it takes much effort. You just got to do it.
Mm-hmm. Did you read the book Do No Harm by Henry Marsh? Are you familiar
I don't
with
read
books. No, you're too busy writing them right now. But he's a distinguished, long time, in his 70s probably, British neurosurgeon. Mm. And most of the book is about his mistakes and his regrets. And one of the things he stresses, it goes back to what you were just saying, is he says for a surgeon, one of the hardest things is knowing not to perform surgery and to decide, I'm not going to do any good, because he's got all this expertise, he's ready to race in and save the day, but to realize that's not in the patient's best interest. It's a good book. The next question. My husband is an internal medicine doctor here in Santa Barbara, and one of the things that he's good at is knowing when it's time to move from the life-saving phase to the dying phase for the patient. It seems like so many doctors are not good at that. They're afraid of liability, or they're not equipped to have those conversations with family members. What do you think about having a team of doctors and nurses that would be called in to make that determination, taking the responsibility of the primary care and emergency room doctors?
In a way, that's kind of happening. So the success of palliative care as a subspecialty, as sort of exotic, subspecialized field, you have to have special training to do it, et cetera. Like we were saying earlier, that's part of this corrective that's going on. There's a reckoning, and palliative care is trying to help reorient healthcare to the fact that we're not going to cure everything, we're not going to fix everything anytime soon. So it's kind of gone that way. And as I see this happening at UCSF a lot, it has a very robust palliative care program. And so now a lot of the internal medicine residents sort of outsource caring piece to the palliative care guys. They're so busy, there's so much to be done. So when it comes time to actually sitting and listening to a patient, asking open-ended questions, or helping reveal the sort of transition that person's body's making, all this hard stuff that takes time, oftentimes it'll just, oh, call the palliative care guys. They're the ones who are trained to do it. They're the ones who are really good at it. So there's a problem in that, because what's happening, especially for trainees, they're losing whatever small skill existed them as just human beings. That's getting further sclerosed because they're outsourced. If you're not careful, you're outsourcing that to us specialist guys. So I think there's a room for the specialist palliative care guys for the intractable problems, but I think it would be a real mistake to start outsourcing all of these conversations away from the primary docs, whether they're internist or oncologist or whoever else is the primary point person for that patient. I think that would be a real mistake.
It's taking even more humanity out of their job.
Yeah. This subject is what exactly keeps reminding you of your humanity. So rather, let's put that focus on medical education to train people to have these conversations better. Let's work on revamping the healthcare system so the doctor has time to have these conversations. That would be a better way to intervene, I think.
So that almost begins to answer the next question, but everyone must have this. What's your opinion of death with dignity and/or physician-assisted suicide upon the request of the patient?
Well, it's a big question. And you guys know physician-assisted, well, I almost used the old language. So the old language is physician-assisted suicide. Suicide is a very charged word. And so now we use the language aid in dying or medically assisted dying. We know, I'm sure most of you guys, all you guys know that it's legal in California among, I think, 5 or 6 other states now for a physician, under certain circumstances, to prescribe lethal dose of medication to a patient. That's a huge line that we've really struggled with, and still do. There's a very large conversation to be had around that, the pros and cons, the yays and nays. I will say, for myself, there have been times in my practice where I have wished to have had that power, or rather my patients had wished I had that power. I'm not interested in the power, but to help my patient. And there are times I really was frustrated that I couldn't help my patients do what they so honestly wanted to do, which was to hasten their death. Because there does come a time where people are done. And sometimes that happens before their body is actually done. And there are kinds of pain and suffering that, if we're honest, we really can't mitigate. We can do a lot, but we can't do everything. So I think I hear this growing refrain around aid in dying is really, I think practically speaking, it's a small point. So like in Oregon, the state where it's been legal to do this since 1997, it's been pretty consistent. About 0.4% of deaths per year are by folks' own hand in this way. It's a small number. So practically speaking, it's a relatively small issue. Symbolically, it's huge. I think that what we, public, are saying here is, medicine, you don't have all the answers. Quit pretending you do. And 2 is, whose body is this anyway? So that's how I read this refrain and how these laws are gaining steam. So I'm glad that I and others in my profession are trained to have these conversations and to suss out untreated pain from depression, from boredom, from loneliness, from a real desire to hasten their death. Because those things, if you're not careful, look a lot alike. And so one of the worries is that you're giving this gatekeeper function to physicians who are not really trained so exquisitely to see these differences. And while someone may come to you and say, please, doc, I'm dying, I'm dying soon anyway, please help me, give me this prescription, that is very often a cry for help. And if you take that immediately at face value, you may be shortchanging someone in very dramatic ways, and in ways you may never know because that person will be gone. So this is not to be treated lightly, and it's no small thing to ask another human being to help to end your life. So, and finally, I think one of the concerns about this law, some of my colleagues have, is that where's the outcry that we don't have more palliative care? in healthcare? Why are we not training more palliative care docs? Why aren't we putting more of our resources in this direction to do the things that we know help people suffer less? If suffering is the currency that allows a doctor to anoint you dying sooner, and we're not, as a society, doing all that we already know how to do to mitigate suffering, why are we going to this why are we doing this end around and helping people just get off the planet sooner? Some of my colleagues want to hold the tension there so that would forces societal and systems change rather than just the convenience or expedience of dying sooner. And I understand that. So it's a big, big subject. I will say, in answer to the question though, ultimately I am glad to have, I believe that there is a right in there, and I'm glad this exists, but we've got a long way to go before we've really reconciled all that's wrapped into this very symbolic and heavy issue.
Thank you. I'll paraphrase the next one, but it's more or less, what part do you find spiritual belief plays in the dying process? How much does it help?
So a lot, I think. And so just lumping, sort of spirituality, religion, spiritual traditions, etc. If you have a way of seeing the world that includes death, I mean, again, as we were saying earlier, so much of the trouble comes from a worldview that doesn't include this reality, and you're really in trouble. So if you have a worldview, whether it's spiritual or true believers, in my experience, truly faithful people do well at the end of life around this subject, and atheists, people who are equally convinced there's nothing besides what's in front of us, those guys do pretty well on this point. It's those of us who don't really know, haven't really thought about it, or haven't taken our faith seriously, may have gone to church kind of reflexively or because there are, beautiful ceremonies or something, but we didn't really test our faith or think about it, and then all of a sudden, there are no atheists in foxholes, right? And then all of a sudden you're being called to the mat, and all of this is becoming very, very real, and your faith is really unexplored. Then you're in a whole other world of hurt because you've casually thought, oh, well, I'm fine because I believe in God. Sure, there's a God. So that kind of casual faith or incomplete faith is really, it can create some really spectacular pain at the end of life. So I think that's my answer to your
Okay.
But I guess I don't want to end on that note on that question. I want to say, too, if we can take spirituality to be never mind religion or faith for a second, if we can take spirituality to be this unseen connecting force among us, if we can take spirituality to mean sort of a connection to wonderment and to awe and all that we don't understand and to mystery, that kind of spirituality, which in this way I feel very much a spiritual being, I think that helps us a lot. I think that is very beautiful because whether you're alive or dead, you still belong to something very large and very beautiful. So in this way, so never mind religion or faith, I think spirituality has a lot to soothe people at the end of life, absolutely.
And on a different note, earlier today you were talking to me very excitingly about death ed and how kids who get sex ed classes in certain cases now are learning about death. And I was thinking how 150 years ago, I think the majority of people died at home, which meant that little kids were witness to death, had lived with it, experienced it. Now it's removed. You could live to 30 now and never have seen a death. So that kind of education makes a difference.
Yeah. Can I give a shout out real quick on that?
Yeah.
Jessica Zitter and Dawn Gross, colleagues up in the Bay Area, have actually spoken about this and are going to their kids' school and actually creating these death ed programs. I just want to name them and herald their work. I think it's really beautiful for all the reasons we've talked about tonight.
Thank you. What do other cultures, countries do regarding palliative care that Americans could learn from?
Great question. I don't know the answer. I keep meaning to spend some time studying other forms of this kind of care and seeing what else others are doing. So I don't have a real answer except to say my guess is there's a lot going on that we could borrow from. And I don't know that it's so much under the guise of palliative care per se. My sense is actually perhaps we're pretty advanced in terms of standards of care, a body of knowledge, and thought through sort of tenets. I'd imagine that we are actually pretty far advanced in terms of a medical field that way. that field needs to grow, but I think it's actually pretty well honed here as an idea, at least. It certainly is in the UK, and we're basically borrowing from them in a lot of ways, from the hospice model. But never minding palliative care, I think the bigger piece, and that piece of palliative care that is relatively underdeveloped, gets to your question, which is, what are other cultures and other societies doing around this subject? You know, the reminder, of course, this is an ancient subject. We've been doing this for a long, long time, and people have been bouncing off their impermanence for a long, long time. And I'm sure there are all sorts of things we could learn from other cultures and pre-existing societies and current societies that just don't happen to be our own. I am not aware of, I'm sure that more bridges could be built towards understanding what's going on. I just haven't participated in any of them yet.
And probably the way they regard the elderly and the way they regard death would be intrinsic to that.
Absolutely.
So 3 more questions. Each one of these really moved me and covers something we haven't got to yet. One, I was going to ask you this myself, but this person asked it better. As a hospice social worker for 20 plus years, how do you keep your boundaries? And how do you take care of yourself?
Poorly. I am really crappy at boundaries. Part of me, but I don't, the second question, how do I take care of myself? I don't want to, that was not a cry for help. I think I do take decent care of myself. I mean, I committed long ago, after my experiences as a patient, to not taking a sort of a sacrificial or martyr's route through medical training and practice. And if you're not careful, it can go that way. So, boundaries. I struggle with them because I'm not sure I believe in them yet. There's a piece of me that still, when I hear the word boundary, my reflex is, oh, that's something you blow through. That's where my mind immediately goes. Right. And somewhere along the way, I got into my identity that was nifty and cool and fun, and I like it. I do. And it pushes me into places I wouldn't otherwise go if I were so boundaried. And I'm very, very much aware of colleagues and friends who I think draw too narrow a boundary. So I'm really mixed on this question of boundaries. Now, I understand that I have a developmental issue to get through on that one, and that there is and I daily anguish and rail at my what comes of my lack of boundaries. So I've got some learning to do is all I can say. And I will say it's baked into my field is smart enough to be interdisciplinary. So no one person needs to hold all this stuff. I have teammates, I have colleagues, and others to draw upon, but I just have to be careful to make sure to lean on them.
I was very touched. We were just about to come on stage, and you said, oh, I've got to call my patient to find out how her scan. And I mean, even right now, that was your thought. I had been wanting to ask you if you have some daily practice that just allows you to clear your head or stay sane, or, yours is a very stressful and all-consuming job. Do you motorbike? Do you swim? Do you meditate?
Yes, so I love 2 wheels, period. I love my bicycle and I love my motorcycle. There's something about a gyroscope that I just love it. Moving around the planet in this way just thrills me. And it makes me so happy to have a body. So I love 2-wheel action. I love my dog. So there's Vermont, who is my service dog, who helped me through my own injuries and got me through college and med school. And is that Justin Redmond in there? Yeah, Justin, you knew my dog, Vermont. I can't even begin to talk about Vermont, but I have another dog now named Maisie, whom I love incredibly dearly, and 2 cats, the Muffin Man and Darkness. So these guys are really my daily, these animal things, we're supposedly the superior breed. It's so silly. Why we think we have a lock on consciousness is beyond me. But one of the things I love, my dog in particular, well, the cats too, they remind me every day, they're not wasting much time wishing they had a life that they don't have, And that I try to learn from in a daily. They're part of my sort of practice. And the other thing they help me do is, purpose is very powerful and meaning and making is very powerful, but I also want to put a plug for meaninglessness and purposelessness and play and silliness and not knowing. That's part of my daily practice. It can be a little convenient at times, but it is very much part of my practice, and I get that through the aesthetic world, the direct experience of the senses. They're not strategic. They're not on behalf of something else necessarily. They're not a means to an end. They're an end of themselves. Being as an end of itself. Art for art's sake. Being with my dog for its own sake. Playing ball with her, not to exercise her, but to throw a ball for her, just this weird, lovely interaction. That, keeping that as my rudiment, as my foundation, not my list of accomplishments, helps me at the end of the day forgive myself for all that I didn't get done.
Oh, beautiful, thank you. Penultimate question. After being at the bedside of so many people, do you still feel there's a mystery or something to learn? And if so, what is it that you continue to feel or learn?
I do strongly, very much believe there is a great mystery that we're a part of. And I have come to love not knowing. I have, for its own sake, for the curiosity it instills in me. I'm not interested in mastering life and death per se so that I can overcome it. It's like what I've learned from disability. I want to use it. I want to work with it. I want to be beholden to it because I'm part of it. So I also, let's say, especially these days, there's something to willful ignorance too. Let's not go that route. Pretending, it's a weird time. Like, we're pretending to know things we don't and pretending to not know things we do. It's kind of nuts. So let me just say, I love mystery, but I don't mean to impose mystery where there's actually none. I think an important part of dying and dealing with folks, including ourselves who are dying, is demystifying it on some level. But demystification gets you through a lot of the layers of anguish. But in the end, you are still left, or at least I am still left, with very much a mystery. All sorts of things that I can't explain and don't understand and don't know. And, maybe someday humans, maybe our conscious, maybe we'll actually know everything someday. Maybe. And that would be cool. I suppose I wouldn't be against that. But meanwhile, I am thrilled to be part of something that I don't understand. And being at the bedside of folks who are dying only reinforces that. It doesn't make me more sure of anything. It makes me more secure in not knowing.
Thank you. Last question. Sometimes the simplest questions are the best. What can you tell me to make me less afraid of dying?
Morphine comes to mind. Just kidding, sort of. I think, and I really mean this, this is going to sound too convenient, but I would say, and I mean it, don't be afraid of fear. I mean, I've worked with a number of people directly on their fear of dying, and in the end, sometimes they do actually learn all sorts of things about themselves and their situation that actually do lessen their fear. That's possible too. But in the end, the bigger, the more durable, sturdier lesson has been when folks who have just made peace with their fear. They can still be afraid. I'm not asking that we love death or love fear. Just acknowledge it. That seems to be all you need to do. So it's a defanging process. It's learning to just be with fear. Takes its teeth out.
And to be with reality, and to be with sadness, and to be with all the things that if we were super people, we wouldn't be with. Well, thank you all for coming. For those of you who've endured a loss, I was just going to say, for those of you who've endured a loss this week, we really hope you find solace of some kind. And I just want to thank BJ so much for coming at the perfect time to share your wisdom and your kindness. Thank you.
Thank you, Pico. Thank you guys very much. Shall we?
Yes. Thank you.